Hey fearsome friends, I'm a little croaky but feeling better. Thank you all for your messages. These petty revenge stories are so much fun. I hope you enjoy them as much as me. From bosses to best friends, to roommates and neighbours, never be afraid to stand up for yourself. When I was 12, my mum made me go to a pool with my younger brother and his friend, who were both 10. We'll call my brother B and his friend F. F was white as hell and said the N-word a lot, so he didn't really have many friends. He also thought that calling people gay was funny. We all went to the pool on our bikes. It was a community pool in a gated suburb, and when we got there we checked in. But as soon as we got in the water, he started calling people gay. F asked a 5-year-old, "Why are you so gay?" B laughed and I told him to stop being a dick. F replied to me, thinking he was still being funny, "That's what you like to eat." At this point I was getting really pissed off, but I didn't want to start yelling around 3 to 7-year-olds. "Dude, you aren't that funny, please stop," I blurted. Then F told me to F off, and I didn't want to argue with him, so I just stayed quiet after that. F then went to the bathroom along with my brother, when just then I realised that for once I hadn't put on my bike lock. So I quickly left the pool, putting it on F's front wheel. It was just supposed to minorly inconvenience him and just make him have to walk home. But I guess Mother Nature had other plans, because right after I'd walked through my front door, the clear sky suddenly turned dark and started raining. At this point I started feeling bad, and his dad called me over to his house and asked what had happened, so I told him everything. He sent me home and F never bothered me again. So I worked for a call centre where I assist people with a software suite. Most people who call in have a relative level of patience, what some might even call basic human decency, as it sometimes takes time to resolve people's issues. Because I have to communicate with other teams, perform fixes, or reset the user in some way. There is a whole literacy that comes along with learning the software, and what kinds of problems arise. But no matter how long you are around, you are bound to see new stuff come up. I had a user call me with an error message I hadn't seen before, so I told him to wait for a number of minutes while I referred to my resources. The error message was not catalogued, so I sent out a message to an agent who works specifically with the product that the error came up on, and told the customer, who I will call Lumberg, like the Office Space character, because he was villainous, douchey, and I later saw his profile picture, and he actually kinda looks like the cat. While I was waiting for the other tech to get back, I told him I would try a few fixes that have worked for other problems with the product. Unfortunately though, the other tech I had reached out to was off to lunch or something, and it had gotten to be 10 minutes plus, and I had been fiddling with things to no avail. I guess this guy was silently steaming the whole time and turning red. Maybe he had some problems at home. But when he came back, he was being an absolute asshole. Here is a list of a couple of things I remember he'd said on repeat, and this is at the top of his lungs. "Are you done effing wasting my time?" My inner dialogue. I am trying to help you and explaining every detail of what is going on." "You are not helpful. Put me on with somebody else there, you idiot." I thought, literally working from home like everyone else. Heard of COVID? "I don't talk to idiots. Let me talk to your manager." He said this 3 times. All the while I tried to be Rogerian and calm him down, because after all this, his issue was literally no big deal in the first place. Finally this clown took it on himself to hang up. Almost at the same time, that the other tech I'd reached out to had gotten back to me with the fix. This guy seriously got to me though, and I remember something that Richard Pryor said once on the Dick Cavett show about how he once felt hate towards someone and really didn't like the way that it made him feel. So I tried to be zen about it, but honestly, there are no two ways about it. Lumbergh was a slimy human being. I decided to be petty and take down his username, waited 1 month after the incident, and started to log him off from our system from the back end once a week. I did this for 2 weeks, but then realised that he might think this was a system issue and call our line again and give one of the techs crap, so I let it go. I really hope I made that asshole lose a spreadsheet or something. My father is a pastor, and I was always very involved with our church, as well as a larger church in the area that my father worked at while he was getting his degrees. When I was 17, the larger church did a week-long event, which brought in various speakers on different topics. I was big into science, so a speaker doing a talk on flood geology got my attention. I had never heard of this, but thought that it sounded right up my alley. I was unaware that flood geology is a young earth Christian idea, saying that all geologic structures that we see were created at one time during the flood. We were told that the earth is 6,000-ish years old, was created in 6 days, etc., etc. This was fairly new to me. I had heard of this stuff, but had never met anyone who actually believed it. After the talk, I went to speak with the presenter about some questions that I had. Some of what he had said went in the face of what I had learned elsewhere, and just wanted his opinion. He actually went on the attack, which made me really uncomfortable. Eventually I said, well, this isn't a salvation issue anyway, which he interrupted saying, if any of the Bible is untrue, then how can it be the word of God? Then he said something about how I should pray that I can become a Christian and accept God, which I had done as a child, and said he would be praying for me, etc. Well, this literally left me in tears, because no one had ever implied that I was not actually a Christian. I went to our head pastor, not my father, as well as other members of the church to try to get confirmation that I could be a Christian and accept science, which they all agreed with. The head pastor actually laughing at the idea of YEC. However, what he said did make me think, and that whole part of the Bible cannot be false if it is the Word of God thing stuck with me. What followed was my 1-year deconversion. I probably stopped believing after about 3 months, but was in denial for most of a year. This really strained my relationship with my parents for quite some time, and made an already difficult time in my life less difficult. Well, when I was 24, I thought back to how crappy what he had said made me feel, and I thought that I could probably find out who he was and contact him. I was able to figure it out, as he was a recurring speaker at that church, and what do you know, they listed his email. I sent a very short message saying something along the lines of, "Hey church guy, you probably don't remember me, but after one of your speeches, we talked about where the Bible and science disagreed, and how I was trying to make the Bible fit the science. You made me realize that the Word of God cannot be wrong, and saved me a wasted lifetime. Your statement led me to really pray and think on my beliefs, and after months, I came to the realization that there was no reason for me to believe any of this. Thank you for being the catalyst to this understanding. Sincerely, Carl." I got a response from him saying when he would be back in town if I would like to discuss more, and included some links to AIG, as well as some books he recommended I read, which I ignored. It was petty, but I felt so good telling him that he'd helped me to turn into an atheist. All things considered, I am not upset about the outcome of how he treated me, but I like to think that I would have come to this realization without the things he'd said. This is so petty it still makes me smile thinking about it. It was maybe 6 to 7 years ago now, and involved some former colleagues and myself. We'll call them promoted and silent treatment. A good friend of mine at work got a well-deserved promotion after a couple of years at this company. Almost everyone was very happy for her, except for one colleague, who inexplicably took a great offence to it and immediately stopped talking to Promoted, like at all. Not a peep. And as Promoted and I were friends, she stopped talking to me too for good measure. Silent treatment wasn't interested in career progression, and wasn't now being managed by Promoted, so no one knew what the issue was. But understandably it upset Promoted and made a pretty toxic work environment for us. Now, silent treatment and I were not friends at all, so it was no skin off my nose. But I didn't like how it had upset Promoted, so this is where my petty revenge comes in. It just so happened that silent treatment and I got the same bus to work in the morning. Like almost all buses in the UK, you have to ring the bell ahead of your stop to tell the driver you want to get off. Silent treatment would always sit right at the very front, so regardless of what seat I took, I would always be behind her, which meant I could see what she was doing and lie in wait. You see, from that day forward, every time silent treatment would raise her arm and reach out for the bell, I would be there ahead of her and ring it in a fraction of a second sooner, leaving her to lower her hand back down in silent frustration. Now, why didn't silent treatment just stop trying to ring the bell and let me do it? Well, because she insisted on always sitting right at the front, so she couldn't actually be sure I was going to ring it, as she couldn't see me. So if no one rang the bell, she would have to miss the stop. She also couldn't ask me to stop without breaking her silent treatment. Unbelievably petty, yes. Deeply satisfying? Hell yes. So a friend and I were renting a house about 10 years back, and he was an extremely extroverted person. He would do anything to be surrounded by as many people at all times, as much as he could. However, I was the exact opposite. I enjoyed my own company, but put up with him having people over, because it was his home as well. He then started getting really pally with a girl and her boyfriend that would be there constantly. Fine, whatever. The couple were there so much that they ended up using my sofa bed every night, rather than go home. I would find out from another one of his friends that this couple would constantly talk crap about how much of a loser I was, whilst staying under my shared roof, on the sofa bed that I paid for. Now for the pettiness. There was a clock in the living room where they slept. It was only a cheap one, but every second it made a loud clack noise, which was really annoying at night. I found it one morning on the floor with the batteries next to it, so I put the batteries back in, then superglued an old CDR over the battery compartment and did the same to the clock on the wall. They decided to go home the next day. This happened a year or two ago when I was about 16. My computer programming teacher wasn't able to make it in for a few days, and we were assigned a substitute teacher. When the class started, the sub, Mr. Dumb, explained the situation and that we could access our assignment online, because Mr. Dumb felt the need to prove his intelligence to people under half his age. He explained that he'd graduated university with a computer science degree and then demonstrated that he was able to take control of our computers, so we shouldn't mess with him. I should explain that due to there being no prerequisite to the class, but there being an introduction for those interested a year early, the coursework was easier for people who took the introduction class. Me being one who loves computers, I'd already taken it and had some experience, and after reading the assignment, I went to Mr. Dumb and asked him a question. "Hi sir, the assignment states to use a loop. However, it didn't specify what type. Was there a note left explaining for people who are more advanced if we could be required to use the one loop we'd learned, or if we'd be able to use previous knowledge to make a more efficient program?" Mr. Dumb looked at me with an idiotic look on his face, and even a toddler could tell he didn't understand any of what I'd just said. "The instructions are online," he said, in an extremely condescending way. "I understand, but..." He cut me off, now a lot louder and borderline yelling. "If you're so smart, figure it out yourself." I decided it wasn't worth it, and I knew our original teacher would be back before it was due, so I just went back to my computer. I started helping a few of my friends in class, and one particular friend, who sat right next to Mr. Dumb, needed a lot of help as they'd missed a couple of the previous lessons. So I pulled up a chair and sat helping them. The whole class, whenever someone asked any question, Mr. Dumb would talk down and belittle them. Halfway through the class, I had had enough and decided to mess with him. While explaining how certain things would work when I ran to my friend, I reached over slowly and unplugged the Ethernet cable from Mr. Dumb's computer. For those of you who don't know, this means not only does he no longer have an internet connection, he can't take control of our computers. When the class started getting a bit louder, Mr. Dumb attempted to take control, only to find out he couldn't. He began to get mad, and after a minute yelled, "Why won't this stupid thing work?" Then some absolute mad lad from the back shouted, "If you're so smart, you should know how to fix it." Mr. Dumb paged the office and demanded the principal come down to help deal with the class. And while he did that, I plugged the Ethernet cable back in and went back to my seat. The principal came, and Mr. Dumb started going on about how we were behaving horribly, and the computer was broken, etc., etc. The principal asked what was wrong with the computer, and Mr. Dumb explained. The principal tried to take control to find nothing wrong, and Mr. Dumb then yelled, "Which of you assholes did this?" To which the principal demanded Mr. Dumb go to his office and wait for him to get there. We then had the cool principal watch us behave perfectly for the rest of the class. This story is from about 15 years ago, when I was first an English teacher at a school in China. I would go to corporate locations and teach the employees how to give reports and PPTs in English, and my manager was an overweight, extremely pale, bald Australian guy called Patrick. But Patrick wasn't bald because his hair was falling out, but rather because, when he'd get stressed out or nervous, he'd sit at his desk and start pulling out his hair one strand at a time and pile it up on his desk. And what made it worse was his absolute caffeine addiction. In the office was his espresso machine, where you open the lid, pour in the ground coffee, and a minute or so later, a steaming espresso would emerge. The more he drank, the more stressed he'd get. The more he'd pull his hair out. A vicious cycle. Patrick was also what I would call a social alcoholic. One of those guys who'll get totally hammered with the clients. He thought this was great, but the clients all called him the Great White Whale, because A, he was fat, B, he was very white, and C, he couldn't balance on the squat toilets in China, and once when drunk had shat all over the karaoke lounge toilet. To top this, Patrick was an utter asshole. He'd always tried to boost his bonuses by shortchanging his teachers on overtime. One day Patrick called me into the office. "Well, I need you to do overtime for 2 weeks at Nokia, and I'll pay you £500 extra." You can't imagine this guy's voice, but it was like a squealing pig. Anyway, I agreed and busted my ass over the next couple of weeks at Nokia, and I did such a good job that the regional manager of Nokia wanted me for all future training sessions. I got called into the office. "Good job at Nokia, but we don't have the budget for the overtime. Here are some Starbucks coupons. Go get yourself some coffee." Now I know I should have been raging, but I'd been saving up some revenge for a rainy day, which meant there was a storm heading Patrick's way. After work, I headed to the Chinese pharmacy and told them I had bad constipation. The pharmacist offered me Western medicine, which he said was more gentle, or Chinese traditional medicine, which would clean me right out. I chose the Chinese medicine, which he went out back to grind from some special roots. He brought it to me in a paper bag and told me to put a pinch in hot water and drink it in the morning. I opened the bag, and to my delight it was black and looked exactly like ground coffee. Even sniffing at it made me want to poop. I think you can see where this is going. The next morning I got to work really early, and I made my way over to the espresso machine. I lifted the lid, scooped out about half of the ground coffee, and replaced it with the Chinese herbal laxatives. I then gave it a good stir and replaced the lid just as Patrick came in and made a beeline straight for the espresso machine. Later, sitting at my desk, which unfortunately faced the whale, I could see Patrick sipping on his coffee and gently pulling out his hair as he checked the weekly reports. Then I noticed his face start to get paler than usual. Then it scrunched up. "Ooh, I think I might have eaten something rotten." You can see the deliberation going on in his head. Hold on, or go to the squat toilet. He was sweating bullets, pulling out his hair, and the whole time still guzzling on that espresso. Finally he made a bolt for the toilets, and the great white whale exploded, again and again and again. He came back to the office looking terrible, with a new espresso in his hand. He sat down, pulled out hair, sipped coffee, then ran to the toilet again, and again and again. 3 days this went on for, until presumably the coffee laxative cleared the machine. The whole time he thought he had food poisoning, but it was easily the best revenge I've ever had. I worked at a desk job in the military a few years back, and my office had 6 people, including myself, who managed manpower and administration. People would be coming in all day for help with their records, moving around the world, deploying and getting out of the military, etc. It was a pretty busy office, with just 6 people taking care of over 1,000. But we had a good team, and everyone had each other's backs. Our immediate supervisor sat across the hall in their own little office, and had a closed-door policy. The next highest supervisor, let's call them the chief supervisor, was incredibly strict and demanding, and eventually led to some of us developing anxiety issues. Enter the new guy. The new guy was young, inexperienced and cocky. The worst part was that he would sit on his phone, totally oblivious when people walked in needing help. He sat at the first desk, the most visible, closest to the door. and part of his job was to greet people when they came in and figure out what they needed so they could be helped by the expert in that particular issue. However, our customers would just stand there awkwardly, waiting for him to even acknowledge that someone was standing in front of him, as he played games and watched football on his phone. People got angry and complained to our chief supervisor, who of course punished all of us, because that's how the military usually works. The rest of us were busy all the time, so we couldn't even see that someone was waiting to be helped. After a while, our chief supervisor caught on that the issue was this young guy playing on his phone all day, so she threatened severe punishment if she caught him on it again during work. To make sure it was fair across the board, all of us were banned from having our phones during work. Of course, that made us angry, because we frequently used our phones for a million different reasons, many of which were directly work-related. So the rest of us got together and hatched our simple but effective plan. A few days later, when our chief supervisor walked into our office, she just missed the new guy watching football on his phone. On her way out, she suddenly heard the sounds of a football game coming from his desk. His sudden realization that she was now giving him a death glare made him go pale and shrink back into his chair. She told him to follow her, and they left for her office. Quietly, the rest of the office celebrated getting him into trouble and recovered the Bluetooth speaker we had hidden under his desk. My co-worker who sat next to me had paired it with his phone and had a recording of a football game ready to play at just the right time. The new guy didn't get kicked out of our office over it, but when we all confronted him for his general laziness, his feelings were hurt, and when he asked to leave our department, his request was quickly approved. This is a story about the neighbour from hell, and we will be calling him Steve, as I don't even know his real name. So Steve was always calling the cops over petty things. My family has lived here for 7 to 8 years now, and he calls the police once every couple of years. The first time was when his kids were outside around 10:30 p.m. on a Friday night, and my dogs were barking because they were screaming and generally just being loud. The next time was because one of his chickens had been killed by an animal, most likely a fox or coyote, or even a stray cat, and he claimed that one of my dogs had somehow gotten through the locked doggy door and escaped through the fence to eat his chicken. The responding officer asked if he'd seen it happen, and Steve told him that he hadn't, but he just knew it was our dog, to which the officer laughed in his face. The third time was because my uncle had gotten caught in the snow, so he reversed rather quickly and tore up some of Steve's grass in the process. A land surveyor that was court-ordered showed up and determined that not only was it not his lawn, but he had his chicken coop and half of his garden on our property. We didn't care about the chickens and garden, simply because our houses are separated by a creek, and the chickens and garden were located on his side of the creek. He recently called the cops again, because my boyfriend was playing with a laser pointer and acting like a stormtrooper. He was not aiming it at people's homes, but it just so happened he momentarily flashed it into Steve's window. Steve came to our house and threatened my dad, getting in his face and acting like he was going to swing. Well, my family decided that enough was enough, and we have started building a fence. We started it right on his side of the creek too. Steve heard us bright and early hammering away and came outside in his boxers and a pair of slippers. He told us he would call the cops and have us arrested for trespassing, except we were still on our property line. So my dad showed him the house plan and pointed to the pegs the surveyor put down that showed our property lines. He stood there for an hour screaming at me, my little brothers, my boyfriend, and another neighbour, as we all worked until we got to his garden. He was so mad when he realised we were going to fence right on through it, and he ran to move his chicken coop. though we were going to take his chickens because pets are family. He did call the cops afterwards, and they didn't even show up, because it was our land, and technically he was the one damaging our property. We just finished that side of the fence Sunday afternoon, after a couple of days of work. Now we'll have, carrots, tomatoes, squash, and an abundance of strawberries, as well as an apple tree that we didn't even know existed, and an in-ground fire pit he was using to burn trash. In addition, now his kids can't shoot pellets and BBs at us, and our dogs. Take that, Steve. So this took place many years ago, and I don't think technically qualifies as the pettiest thing my friend has ever done on my behalf. But regardless, I think it's worth sharing. I had been dating Becca for around a month when we decided to break it off. It was just a run-of-the-mill high school relationship. We had fun for a bit, and as far as I understood, we broke it off mutually over a weekend. So Monday rolled around and everything seemed cordial between us. Now my friend and I are as thick as thieves, and I made sure to fill her in on the breakup, because I knew she had gym during the same period as Becca, and Anna can be a bit of a hothead. Becca is my ex, and Anna is my best friend. So Anna and I sat through first period, then went our separate ways for the second. Now my class is across the hall from the gym, and the water fountain that we use to get drinks during. So about 20 minutes into class, I saw Anna trying to catch my eye at the fountain. I got up, grabbed a bathroom pass, and excused myself, and Anna looked like a deer in headlights. As I walked up to her, she hugged me and quietly said, "Jackbox, get rid of this somewhere," and pulled out a fistful of denim from under her gym clothes and shoved it into my hands. She then ran away and back off to class. And just to clarify, Jackbox was our code for something is happening, no time to explain, just do as I ask. So I walked down to the bathroom and unfurled the cloth to find the lower 2/3 of a leg from a pair of jeans. Shaking my head and confused, I crammed them into the bottom of the waste paper bin and covered it with damp paper towels. Then I went back to class and tried to focus until it finished. Class let out and I all but sprinted to the locker that I was sharing with Anna to find her not there yet. So I grabbed my books and waited. Anna walked up 5 minutes late from class, and I pulled her aside to ask her what the hell was going on. She looked up at me and explained that whilst they were changing for gym, she overheard Becca bad-mouthing me and saying a bunch of untrue things. She was just trying to save face because her friends were giving her crap for dating a sophomore, was how she explained it. "Anna, what the hell did you do?" was all I could think to say, as she went on to explain the sequence of events. I picked the lock to her gym locker when she left, but I panicked because I didn't know what I was going to do. Then there was a pair of scissors hanging on the wall for cutting the passes, so I panicked more and grabbed the first thing in there and cut it, which turned out to be her jeans. When I realised what I'd done, I shoved the leg into my shirt and slammed the locker shut. I knew I couldn't throw it away in the locker room, because they would find it when she'd freaked out. So that's why I gave it to you. At this point, I was in complete stitches, trying to understand what the hell she'd done. "So you heard her being an ass and just thought, I'm going to mess up her stuff," I said, not being able to contain myself. "Well, I knew I was going to do something like cut the string on her panties, but it just got away from me." By this time, Becca came storming around the corner, and I absolutely lost it. I couldn't stand up straight for laughing so hard, because she was wearing the jeans with one leg ending just above the knee. To make matters worse, I was doubled over, so every time I tried to stand up, I had to look right at the ruined leg. Becca started screeching a bunch of obscenities at Anna, so I got myself together to confront her. "Becca, I'm sure Anna has no idea what's going on with your pants, and we can let it go, or we can have a nice loud conversation about what exactly you put on the menu a week after we got together. Just keep that psychopath away from me and my stuff," was all she could throw back, as she stomped off down the hall red-faced. We spent the rest of the day giving Becca a wide berth, but I could not stop breaking down, laughing at every single time I walked around the corner and saw her mismatched pants. The moral of the story is, you can choose the high road all you want, but one partially unhinged best friend will always be there to be as petty as humanely possible on your behalf. My ex and I didn't date for long, but it's safe to say that it was an awful relationship. He was very abusive, and I had to go to intensive therapy after our breakup. Anyhow, when we were together, he had this friend named A who was having a birthday party. He confided in me that he'd had a crush on her for 2 years, but now had just found her boring. He asked if I would go to the party with him, and she said that her roommates had said no. I felt a tad uncomfortable, but told him he should go anyway because it's his friend. He decided not to go on his own accord, and then proceeded to not even text her happy birthday. We ended up breaking up for about 2 days, which was toxic in and of itself. But he'd shown me once we were back together how he'd told her he was sorry he didn't go to her birthday party, and how I was controlling and crazy. He had hung out with many women I didn't know alone, with no issue, me not bothering or questioning him. I didn't care, because I can't stop someone from doing what they want, and it's not my job to babysit someone's actions. The fact that he told her that was not cool with me, because it felt as though he was crazy-making and trying to get with her. So we'd gotten back together for a very short amount of time before I dumped him for good, and I reached out to her, since he told her I was jealous of her too. She was very receptive and sweet, and we decided to hang out, when I came to find out that he'd asked her on a date and she'd rejected him. We had brunch together and it was great fun. Last night she invited me out for drinks. We were having lots of fun and flirting with guys. Then we went back to her place and started making out. We decided to FaceTime my ex and show him we were hanging out, despite him bad-mouthing me to her and vice versa. He told me he didn't want to date her because she was rude for rejecting him. We then started making out on FaceTime in front of him, then hung up. She initiated all of it, and it was both our first time with another woman. It was so fun and interesting, and honestly, this turned out to be the best thing ever. But I was worried and expressed my concerns for us hooking up, and how it might ruin our friendship. Although I've given her money for Starbucks today, to get herself a drink as she's hungover and had to work early, and we've been texting normally ever since. So back in 2014, the house next to ours was bought in a tax sale. It had been repossessed by the bank, and the family living there were evicted, and it was bought by an older man who also owns condos and apartment complexes in the capital city. He, his partner and their team, tore that house to the ground and rebuilt it. The house itself is the most beautiful on my street, and is one of the most valuable, expensive residential lots in the whole town. It's worth $500,000, while most of all the houses on my street, and the few surrounding, are only worth $10,000 to $20,000, and some are worth less. Once the house was done, it of course went up on the market, and the couple who bought it figured they'd live in it until they got a buyer. However, the woman died in 2016, and the man decided to move back to be nearer to their family. So he found someone to rent a room in the house for almost nothing, maybe $200 a month. Normal rent for even a rat trap apartment in my town is between $800 and $1,500, and left. For the first little while, things were okay. The tenant is a very old man, who at first seemed like your typical lonely, no-family old man. He'd have conversations with us, ask us for help with yard work, and basically came off as the type of person who just needed human contact. We noticed he had a staring problem, but again, he's an old man with no family, so we just shrugged it off. However, it got to the point where he'd sit at his windows and just look into our house at all hours. So we got thicker curtains and again shrugged it off. Within a couple of weeks, we'd caught him peeping through our windows, and he once wandered into our house. We quickly switched from lonely old man to creep alert, but the cops wouldn't do anything, or would just say, "He's probably got some sort of dementia. He's harmless." So we basically covered all our windows and locked our doors at all times. From then on though, every time we'd leave the house, he'd talk to us and try and give us gifts. So we couldn't go down our driveway and had to sneak out the back to go anywhere just to avoid him. He also started creeping on any guests we had. Eventually, we just said F it and started ignoring him. We started wearing headphones or faking phone calls whenever we had to be out front or were coming and going. Now I'm slightly hard of hearing, so I just straight up ignored him, and when I'd accidentally meet his gaze, because I would feel him staring, I'd use what little ASL I knew, and he'd give up. He knew I could talk, but I lip read a lot, and don't talk a whole lot by choice. By early 2018, we figured he'd given up trying to interact with us, and things were for the most part peaceful. But we still couldn't leave our windows facing his house uncovered, because he'd still always be staring. But he stayed on his side of the fence, so we figured a couple of windows versus all of them was a fair trade. Early summer, probably right before it began on the calendar officially, I noticed him struggling to carry some heavy things. A rental rug cleaning machine, and various cleaning products into the house. I felt pity for him, creepy or not, as he couldn't be more than 90 pounds, soaking wet, and we knew he had health issues that kept him largely homebound, so I decided to help him carry the things over the steps, rather than watch him struggle. He'd never harmed us, so I didn't see the need to be that rude. He thanked me, and then asked me if I'd be willing to come by the next day and clean the floors. He assured me the machines would do most of the work. He just needed someone to do the physical part of moving the machines around and up 3 floors of the house. I talked it over with my parents, and they weren't thrilled, but agreed that it would be a nice thing to do. Big mistake. The next day, around midday, I went over and got to work. I noticed bugs and a smell I can only describe as how a dissected smoker who was left in the sun for a week would smell. But again, he was a sick man who clearly had nobody helping him. This house was massive, and even a healthy young person would struggle to keep it clean on their own without help. He fed me some sob story about how if he told the homeowner he needed help, he'd probably be evicted, or, to help cover a maid service, have to pay more rent. I was sympathetic, of course, and told him I'd make the floors shine like new. I'm far too sweet for my own good, I know. At first it was fine. He largely locked himself in his room, and I gave those floors a beating. However, because he weighs so little, and I am hard of hearing, I'd often turn around and he'd be just staring down at me from the upper floors. When I noticed, I'd just move out of his line of sight and continue. I managed to get the bottom and second floors done in a little over an hour, since only the stairs were carpet. The rest is a mix of wood and tile. However, once I got up to the 3rd floor, where his room was, I realised how much of a mistake it had been to agree to help. The very top floor of this house is an office that any writer would kill for, a workout area, a couple more bedrooms, closets, and 1.5 bathrooms. His room was at the very end of the hall, so I decided to do that last. First was the office. I was in love with the layout and how the man and his wife had chosen to design it. Light cream-coloured carpet, light chocolate walls with gold designs that turned out to be music notes. Don't worry, be happy, apparently. Makes sense, since while they were still living there, they listened to it constantly. Anyway, back to the point. I noticed that the office allowed direct line of sight into my room, my brother's room, and our shower. It was creepy given the guy living there, but that was just an unfortunate turn of events. I made a note to get thicker curtains for our bedrooms, since the bathroom window was usually always packed full of shampoo bottles, and went about cleaning it. By the looks of it, it was hardly used. I took my sweet time making it down the hall, but I eventually had no choice and made my way down. I could hear a faint adult video sound, but figured that if that was the worst thing to happen, I'd ignore it. Besides, he's in his own room with the door shut, and it's not blasting at full volume. Yes, I know, far too forgiving for my own good, as well as a sympathetic moron. I knocked and asked if his room needed cleaning. He took a moment to respond before saying it did and opened the door. I swept and sprayed it down. The room was too small to do a deep cleaning, and I sure as hell didn't want to be in there that long. Finally, I was done with his room and headed across the hall to the final one. I felt him staring, so I shut and locked the door before giving the room a once-over. I likely half-assed it since I just wanted out of that house. When I opened the door to inform him I was done, I was horrified to find him pleasing himself while staring right at me. I don't remember what I said, but I flew down those stairs and out the door so quickly that Usain Bolt would have eaten my dust. I told my parents, and honestly, if this man was younger, my father would have probably been doing life in the pen for killing him. But because he's so old and sick, we were able to talk him down, somewhat. He went and got the money I was owed and came back with almost $200. We thought that was it. He made no more attempts to interact with us. The gifts stopped. He stopped camping out to peek in the windows for the time being, and it felt almost normal again. However, my father refused to let my mother or I do anything that kept us in front of the house, so he and my brother maintained the front yard, while my mother and I did the back and side. That became our normal, and it worked quite well. But, and there's always a but, nothing is perfect. Eventually there came a day in midsummer 2019 when my father was working and my brother was sick, and the yard work couldn't wait as there was a storm coming. So against all better judgment, we went and started the front yard. At first it was what you'd expect, and we were making progress. However, that changed when my mother suddenly screamed and threw me behind her. Turns out she'd happened to notice him out the corner of her eye, and she caught him pleasing himself while he watched us on full display. We screamed and ran inside, phoning the cops and my father to get him to come home a few hours early. The cops said there was nothing we could do, since we didn't have proof, and he stayed on his side of the fence. Honestly, what good are cops? My father? He rounded up his cousins, my uncles, on his way home. They're all above average height, and while very thin, they're very muscular from working the trades all their lives. So I would imagine watching all of them climb out of a small vehicle, armed with aluminium sluggers, crowbars, was probably similar to a clown car from hell. To their credit, they didn't smash this man or his van to smithereens. I was shocked, as none of these men ever back down from a fight when my mum, myself, or any female relative is concerned. But they made enough of a scene that the creep hid in his house for several days with the curtains closed. Was that the end? Of course not. He took to camping out in his van at all hours, and resumed staring at me. I took to flipping him off and showing him the knife I'd started carrying. It is my father's, and it can gut even the biggest bull moose as easily as it goes through warm butter. Eventually, I got my best friend, who is badass in every way, ex-military, high level in several martial arts, and a collector and expert in using or crafting almost every weapon from a knife, gun, all the way to something the Dragonborn would use, to literally just stare him into submission. He lasted all of 30 seconds before he backed down, and as of right now, aside from the drunken antics of his housemates, he's never even looked in my direction. He parked his van in the other direction, and also no longer tries to talk to our guests either. My 5th grade teacher used to elect the best behaved boy and girl to be king and queen for the day, and the role had many broad powers. It was essentially being the teacher's right hand, so it was a very lucrative and sought-after role. As a royal, you were in charge of lining up fellow classmates to go to recess and lunch, handing out papers, and you can bench anyone that was misbehaving for the day. If you were benched, you were not allowed to play in the yard during recess and lunch. You just had to sit there. So one Monday, a girl named Joanna approached me and said that her friend Sarah liked me and wanted me to be her boyfriend. As a 10-year-old, I was ecstatic that somebody liked me, and so I said, sure. Sarah came over and we sat together and tried to make conversation, but it was going nowhere. And later that night, I regretted getting with her, because there was no spark between us. Throughout the week, I couldn't play with my friends, because she made me feel guilty about leaving her alone. I had to spend my time with my girlfriend, and I felt trapped. By Friday morning, I had had enough of Sarah's mental gymnastics, so I wanted to break it off and get time to myself and my friends. I didn't know how to do it though, so I decided I would behave my best to get crowned king to bench her. I figured this way I can have an excuse to go play and hint that I didn't like her. I managed to get crowned king, along with another classmate as queen. Now I needed to find any reason, no matter how petty, to bench this girl. My freedom depended on it. When recess came along, I lined up the class to get ready to go outside. Sarah behaved like she was exempt from the rules, because her boyfriend was king. I can still see her smug face talking and making jokes as I gave her a warning to quiet down. She didn't. That was all I needed. I beelined to the blackboard and wrote her name down under the benched list. She was shocked. Recess came and went, and I was free to roam the yard and play with whomever I wanted. At lunchtime, I called over Joanna and asked her to give Sarah a message. It's over. Joanna went to Sarah on the bench. They exchanged a few words, and Joanna returned with Sarah's reply. She said, "It's been over." For a little bit of background, my dad and I love to play pranks, especially on each other. It was Thanksgiving of 2019, and he'd brought my grandma, sister and I on a cruise. On the cruise they had a buffet area with free soft serve 24/7, and it was the last night, so my dad brought me to the buffet at around midnight for some treats. Being a naive little 11-year-old, I thought I was the coolest person ever. So I went up to the soft serve machine and tried to see what was the highest I could stack the ice cream on the cone. I got it pretty high, around 6 to 8 inches, then walked over to the table, making a big deal of how big it was. "Daddy, look how big I made this ice cream cone," I yelled. "Nice job, buddy," my dad replied. I sat down and started to eat it, and as I was about 2 bites in, my dad took my hand and shoved the rest of the ice cream in my face, then held it there. I fell on the floor laughing, with my face covered with ice cream, and the whole restaurant, which wasn't many people as it was pretty late, looked over and stared at me. My dad then said something that stuck with me. "Now you can get me back, at the best time possible. Wait until I've forgotten about it, and then shove something in my face." And that quote came to bite him back in the ass. I waited and waited, and 2 years passed, so I thought it was about time, because he had forgotten. I just had to wait for the perfect moment to get him. By this time he had introduced us to his girlfriend. My parents are divorced, and it was soon her birthday. Cue the revenge. We'd just eaten a really good dinner and were getting ready for dessert, when I noticed that it was a heavily frosted cake and paper plates, so it wouldn't hurt if I smashed it in his face. We were all happily digging in, when I loudly announced that I was going to the bathroom, so I had a good excuse to be getting up. I walked into the hallway, then silently turned around and tiptoed back into the dining room. I went behind him, then quickly took the plate and smashed it in his face. While the plate was still stuck to his face, with the power of 2 years' worth of revenge in my hands, I kept it there and rubbed it in. I then took my hand away and the plate fell, revealing the look of shock on his face. His facial expression, mixed with the amount of cake mixed in his beard, made it worth the 2-year wait. This happened between my ex-girlfriend and her old roommate, who were both in their late 20s at the time. I'll refer to them as ex and the roommate for this story. So my ex was a single mother with 1 kid, and had recently broken up with her live-in boyfriend, who was not the child's father, and decided to downsize to a 1-bedroom apartment to save money. Whilst looking around at apartments, she mentioned her plans of moving to one of the neighbourhood moms that her daughter was friends with, and it turned out that the neighbour was in a similar situation and wanted to move to a new place as well. They both decided it might be a good idea to move in together and help each other out with the kids and save some money on the apartment and even babysitting. So the 2 of them found a place with 2 decent-sized rooms and an okay-sized kitchen and living room. They discussed some ground rules about having overnight guests, kids, family, or even dates, as both kids were gone at their dad's most weekends, and everything roommates should before making clear moving in. And since my ex had great credit, she decided to put only names on the lease and only my ex on the utilities. I honestly don't know why. So they moved in together and everything was fine for the first 4 to 5 months. They had little squabbles now and then, but nothing major. But suddenly the roommate changed. She began taking advantage of my ex's kindness in a lot of ways. The roommate would leave her daughter at home with my ex at night and come home completely drunk, stumbling around at 3 a.m. on a school night, waking up the whole house. She would bring people over to drink and be loud when the girls had school, and I had just become romantically involved with ex at this point, so I witnessed some of the goings-on. Ex finally had had enough and told her this wasn't okay, and warned her they couldn't live together if she kept up this behaviour. The roommate basically brushed her off and said it was her house too, so she'll do what she wants. After that, the partying slowed down, but then the roommate started taking over the apartment, having family over to sleep in the living room for a week or more at a time, both male and female. My ex was obviously not okay with this, and would get yelled at to shut off the light and stop making noise whilst making coffee or feeding her kid before school. She snapped and told the roommate she was going to be putting in her 30 days soon, and she should start looking for a new place, The roommate laughed and told X she didn't have the balls, asking her where she'd go. She told her she wouldn't leave, and she couldn't kick roommate out as she paid half the bills. It got so bad they couldn't have a conversation without yelling at each other, so they would communicate by leaving notes. My ex contacted the landlord to tell him she was leaving on X date, giving the roommate 6 weeks' time to look for a new place. She even tried to tell the roommate she was leaving, but roommate said she was bluffing. Now the revenge. The day after, the roommate's daughter had left for a 2-month trip with her dad. My ex had called up roommate's baby's daddy and filled him in on what was happening. He laughed and said, "Don't worry, the kid will be taken care of." And my ex waited for the roommate to leave for work. When 4 guys in a moving truck showed up and cleared out the house, she took everything that belonged to her, the sofa, fridge, plates, etc., and cleaned out her room, then shut off the electricity cable and internet. Then all that was left was a TV, lamp, microwave and a dining room table, and an envelope that had eviction notice paperwork inside. On the way out, my ex crossed paths with the roommate in the parking lot as she was walking towards the apartment with some co-workers. So X waited and watched to see the roommate's reaction. She screamed, tried to turn on lights, and had a full-on meltdown. My ex smiled, then drove away to live happily ever after, and the daughter ended up living with her dad and having a great life. So this story is from back in 2012, not too long after my father had passed away. At the time, I was working as a home shopping picker at a large chain supermarket here in the UK. Our contract at the time was 5 a.m. start and finish at 11 a.m. And as the company was always trying to save money, they got us to just do the job, then send us home, so it meant we got to go home early. Well, as time went on, my father popped it, and we were now 1 wage short, so I told my mother I would see what I could do. To help pad my wage, I called the benefits people to see if I could get working tax credit. This is an add-on to a wage if you are earning below a certain amount. After talking to the lovely people, who were very helpful indeed, it turned out I was 2 working hours short to qualify. No issue, I thought. It's only 2 hours. So on my next shift, I had 1-to-1 with my manager to explain what I needed, which was 2 extra hours on my contract. Of course, she said that it would not be an issue, and I don't see why not. So I left feeling happy in the knowledge that things would get sorted and I would be able to claim my benefits to help out with the household bills. Fast forward 2 months later, and I was still waiting to hear back from my boss about the hours. I went to have a word with her, and lo and behold, she had not even bothered to ask or find out. Well, as you can imagine, I was not pleased, because by this point, we needed the money, and I had also gotten a part-time job that only helped out so much. Thus, I didn't need the 2 hours any longer. By this time, we'd had a dip in orders, so we were getting sent home even earlier. With this in mind, I'd had enough. So I wrote a letter to my manager, stating that I will only work my contract shift 5 to 11. Well, they saw red, and a few days later I had a hire manager come talk to me. Here's how it went. "What's this letter all about? What personal reasons?" "Personal, so you don't need to know," I said. "So let me get this right. You are only going to work your contracted hours?" "Yes." "You will not stay on if it's busy then?" "Correct." "Well, if you're going to be funny over this, then so can I. From tomorrow onwards, you will stay till 11 a.m, even if the others finish and go home, and I will find you something to do." "Oh, I see," I said, smiling inside. And with that, my boss had this big-ass grin on his face, thinking he had won. So let me get this straight. From tomorrow, I will have to finish at 11 a.m. every shift, even if the others go home early. He was grinning. Yes, that's correct. I can be just as petty too. Are you sure on this? I asked. Yes. Shake on it? I said. At that request, he was like, WTF, and shook my hand. I asked him if this was final, and he assured me it was. So with a massive smile on my face, I thanked him and walked off. A few days later, I was so happy, and he asked why I was so happy with my punishment. It was at this point that I explained to him that I am now the only home shopper on full wage because of his sad pettiness, and in the end, having that meant I could drop a day on my part-time job and have the satisfaction of getting one over on an idiot of a manager. So this revenge was my father's, not mine, although I was involved. My parents, especially my father, are extremely generous people, so it's not uncommon for my dad to leave a 200% tip at restaurants that we frequent. When I was in middle school, all the way through to high school, we would go to a fairly nice Mexican restaurant in our hometown. The meal for our family would usually be about $60 in total, and my dad would nearly always leave a tip over $100. This had a couple of benefits. We would always have fantastic service, and my dad would get his way on basically whatever he wanted. He wouldn't be a dick, but would make sure we got seats right by the windows overlooking the river. One day I went separately with some of the guys on my high school baseball team, and we had a server that I was very familiar with. Let's call her Rachel. Well, Rachel gave us the same top-of-the-line service that I was accustomed to, and clearly expected to be compensated for it based on her response to our payment. We all paid for our own meals, and being high school kids working minimum wage jobs, all left pretty minimal tips. She scoffed. Really? As she looked at the receipts and walked off, and it made me feel horrible, because she was pretty condescending about it. Well, the next time we went as a family, and were told Rachel would be our server, probably about 1 month later. And my dad said, actually, I was hoping to get Steve. So we got Steve. From that day on, we never had Rachel as a server, and my dad would only leave his tip in cash. I think he did this to avoid tip splitting like many restaurants do. In the end, she probably missed out on maybe $100 in tips every couple of months, as it was not a small restaurant, and there were many servers. But I think my dad made his point clear. You aren't entitled to a big tip. I do this because I want to.
Hey, thanks for listening. I hope you enjoyed my video. And if you did, could you please give me virtual hugs by subscribing and clicking that notifications button. I also have a Patreon page and YouTube channel membership if you'd like to support me further. Thank you again for being here. Keep being creepy.